So a quick word about IDEA before I hand it over to our moderator for the day. We're the National Network for Development Education, also called Global Citizenship Education in Ireland. Our membership is composed of around 100 members. We pride ourselves of a quite diverse membership. We have members ranging from NGOs to freelancers, schools, teachers, youth centres, community centres, third level education, and much, much more. And what really unites us is that we are educators on global justice issues, no matter the platform, no matter the methodology. And we aim to equip our audiences with skills and knowledge to build a just, equal and sustainable society for all. Us, IDEA as a network, we aim to strengthen our practice and the work that our members do. We promote their work. We raise awareness on development education in Ireland and abroad. And we also advocate on behalf of our members and with our members. Part of our work is to create spaces such as the one we are all part of today. And we aim to create those spaces to discuss topics and maybe create opportunities rather to learn more about important topics for our educational practice. We aim to give the opportunities to members and the audience to meet practitioners, educators and experts on contemporary issues and anything that really has to do with global justice. So this webinar is part of a webinar series. Please do feel free to have a look on our website for other events, like I said, for our members and for any other training opportunities that come up. Before I hand over to Leigh, I'd also like to introduce our interpreters, Irish and language interpreters for the day, Orla and Sarah, and thank them very much for their work. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Leigh, my colleague in IDEA. Leigh is our Policy and Advocacy Manager with a decade and more actually of experience in the international development sector, with a specific focus on human rights advocacy and citizen participation in development. Leigh has lived and worked for 9 years in the Global South and specifically the occupied Palestinian territory, as well as Colombia, and has over 15 years of advocacy experience on international human rights, including in Ireland and at the European level. And yeah, kick off our event today. Thank you again so much, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, Anya. I'm delighted to be moderating today's webinar, which seeks to explore how educators can discuss justice when they teach about Palestine. We ask ourselves, and we've asked our esteemed speakers today, to think about what are our responsibilities as educators when we discuss conflict-related violence and displacement, and what approaches can we use? How do we ensure dignity and solidarity are central to our practice? So these were the questions we'd asked the speakers to think about when preparing their interventions today, and also to think about the challenges and lessons learned that they have acquired in their years and decades of educating on this topic. So I am delighted to introduce our first speaker for today, who is Dr. Brendan Ciarán Browne, a native of Belfast, is an interdisciplinary scholar with degrees in law and also a PhD in sociology. He has held academic and research positions at Queen's University, Belfast, and at Bard College at El Quds University in occupied Palestine. And he's currently assistant professor and a fellow at Trinity College Dublin. He's assistant professor in conflict resolution. His research interests are transitional justice, settler colonialism, liberal peace building, and conflict and forced displacement. He is an award-winning teacher. He was nominated 3 times for Trinity College Dublin's prestigious Provost Teaching Award, and he was awarded the accolade in 2019. He's a recognised global expert on conflict and resistance in occupied Palestine, and he is a frequent global policy and conflict analyst for global media outlets. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over now the mic to Brendan, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction, and I really am grateful to be invited to this event and to speak on this topic, one that I think is extremely important at this moment now more than ever. I can't really recall a time in recent history as precarious or as dangerous when it comes to the struggle for Palestine and for inevitable liberation in Palestine. And by extension, I can't recall a time as dangerous when it comes to organising, and an environment as coercive and violent when it comes to organising events and speaking about Palestine. As you mentioned, my entire professional life has been focused on working in and for Palestine, and I spent a lot of time in the education sector working at the Al-Quds University in occupied Jerusalem. And in that sense, I owe a really big debt of gratitude to the people of Palestine and for Palestine in general for what it taught me, how to be clear when it comes to challenging the violent impact of Zionism and its racist outworkings, and to unashamedly then platform the legitimate demands of anti-colonialism and of resistance. Palestine really awakened in me the need to remove any sense of compromise when it means when we are pursuing justice in the face of present day and historical colonial violence. And it's these principles that I hope to share this afternoon, just a few of them, that guide me then when it comes to educating on Palestine and when it comes to working towards peace and justice in the region, and a peace that isn't weaponized nor softened or blunted by rhetoric or Western imperial interests. I just want to recall one particular moment of personal transformation for me, and Bana will remember this, my colleague on the call. I was teaching a class at Al-Quds University, and I was beginning to sit down and teach a session on transitional justice and truth recovery in spaces of conflict. And this was at a time when our university campus was being violently attacked on a daily basis by the Israeli army, who were coming in and smashing the place up. And as I began to teach, I could hear a commotion taking place outside. I just ignored it, and I began to start my class. And as I was starting, I noticed that one of my students got really quite visibly upset. And I stopped teaching and I just asked her, look, is everything okay? Are you okay? And she just said, Professor, you see that noise you hear outside? That's a gathering of colleagues and friends for my cousin who was shot dead last night in Hebron. What is the point in talking about any of this, of truth recovery, of justice, of peace building? There's no such thing as justice in Palestine. These words are just a load of nonsense. This is nothing. And that intervention was so powerful and impactful on me because it shook in me that liberal persuasion that has thankfully long since disappeared, because it reaffirmed in me the reality that when it comes to talking about Palestine, we have a duty to seriously consider the impact of our language on our framing as educators, as comrades in the struggle, because the framing and the language and the importance of the affirmation of core principles are crucial as to how we then pass these messages on to those who are under our educational care. And so for the next 12 minutes, I think, I focus on what I believe some of those core principles are that we must steadfastly hold on to. And these require constant attention, and they require constant recommittal. And I'll just state them, and whilst also outlining areas that I think areas where I think educators on Palestine must also consider as we choose to join the struggle. And we can return to any of these points in the conversation. So core principle number one, as educators, when we talk about peace building and justice in and for Palestine, we have to be honest in our appraisal of the factorial causes that are undermining the attainment of both. This is about framing, far from presenting the reality of the Palestine situation through the language of conflict or intractability or a situation of two states or two sides who can't get along. We have to be very, very clear here that the only way to frame this is through the language of colonization. And this has been well established through decades of scholarship and interventions. People have been talking this from the 60s. But more importantly than that, and this is a trap we see so many educators fall into, we have to present this not as an historical colonial process, but rather as an ongoing colonial situation. And so by extension, and logically, when we ensure our framing is fulsomely and determinately grounded in a present-day understanding of the violent nature of settler colonialism, at this very moment, manifesting itself through genocide, it's necessary then that we use the language of resistance, the language as the only legitimate response to colonialism being anti-colonial struggle, or to put this another way, as the legally principled and internationally endorsed resistance against ongoing colonization. We have to proudly stand up and say that without fear of equivocation, because to paraphrase Edward Said, a man who, by the way, taught in the heart of empire and who had bombs sent to his office at Columbia University, any critical scholar, educator, activist, or peace builder who's truly invested in Palestine must nurture space in their classroom to evaluate the right of colonized people to agitate for self-determination, including through armed struggle. This is outlined in UN Resolution 37/43. Now, I'm not saying that's easy. I'm not saying it's without challenge. I have well learned the hard way when it comes to deliberating armed struggle. It's the quickest way to shake up the liberal sensitivity of your classroom. The dynamic, I assure you, will change. But if you're being honest and true to the significance of language, you ought to be reaching no other logical conclusion. There's no space and there's no time to placate liberalism in the face of catastrophic Palestinian erasure. Core principle number one. Core principle number two. When we talk about and teach about justice and interventions for peace, the frameworks for attaining these elusive concepts in and for Palestine are enshrined within an existing language of international law. Our global institutions have made it abundantly clear that there are multiple actions at this moment in time and historically that have been considered breaches of international law, as John Reynolds, an esteemed scholar of international law, showed in the previous seminar. These institutions, including the International Court of Justice, their two separate advisory opinions, and most recently, the opinion delivered by the International Criminal Court pertaining to genocide, have all determined that Israel is in breach of international law, is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, and is being led by political leaders who stand accused of war crimes. So none of this is negotiable. It has been established. But what also needs to be consistently reaffirmed, particularly when it comes to our role as educators when teaching on Palestine, is that third-party states, including Ireland, have a duty and an obligation to uphold international law. This is not negotiable. You can't pick and choose certain aspects of international law for sake of political expediency. And yet that is exactly what is happening in the context of this particular moment. And so if we're being true to our language and our role as educators, it is critical that we remind our students that there is plenty of opprobrium to go around. Third-party states who fail to implement the decisions of these global legal institutions are, by extension, complicit in the facilitated attempted erasure of the Palestinian people in Palestine. Therefore, our anger, whilst certainly there for the genociders and the colonial militias rampaging across Gaza and the West Bank, are also directed inward at our own governments. On to the next one, core principle number three. A particular issue that seems to afflict so many scholars and so many educators, it must be said, is the need to platform all sides of the argument to be seen to be unbiased or in pursuit of some kind of objectivity. This leads to scenarios such as what we saw unfold in RTE recently when the Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, left a radio interview saying that the talking points and the positions that were being platformed by the interviewer were straight out of the Israeli stock phrase handbook, all in RTE's purported aim of objectivity, the most establishment example of attempted respectability politics. But why should we claim that those engaged in a genocide, as I've established through multiple legal organs and other human rights organizations being shown to be complicit in apartheid, crimes against humanity, displacement, why should their position be given any sort of legitimacy alongside the rights of the Palestinian people to resist? This is completely absurd. And so the only logical, justice-oriented principle we should adopt when we teach on and for Palestine is one of deplatforming racist ideologues, deplatforming racist policies, and ensuring that these people are not given the airtime. And let me put this to you. You wouldn't feel compelled to give the KKK airtime, nor suggest that they had legitimate grievances when we discuss the civil rights movement in America? Would we actually feel okay with giving the apartheid Afrikaans regime in South Africa a fair hearing alongside the legitimate demands of the anti-apartheid movement led by Mandela, one based on equality, dignity, freedom, and respect for all? So why do we bend over backwards when we give airtime to the viewpoints of an army and society that is predicated on the erasure of Palestinians? Respectable politics, no place for it. So what are our recommitments? I have about 4 minutes left. In the preamble to this session, we're asked, what are our responsibilities as educators when it comes to discussing conflict and violence? How do we ensure dignity and solidarity are central to our practice? I feel I've covered the ensuring dignity part quite a bit. So I just want to put forward a few things I think we must be willing to do when it comes to living up to our responsibilities. And firstly, we must be continuously educating ourselves. Understanding and being truly committed to the cause of liberation in Palestine requires you to be up to date, not only on the foundational work, not only the early critical scholarship, but the swathes of material that is being produced by our colleagues in Palestine being erased off the face of the earth. And I mentioned it at the start, Palestine has taught me more than I can thank it for, but it's a process. You have to be willing and committed to do the educational work on yourself. Otherwise, you're going to have gaps, those gaps which will ultimately impact upon your pedagogy, which will become subsequently blunted, less sharp, and less developed. We have no time for clumsiness. There is no time for mistakes. Next, you have to be prepared. You have to be prepared to accept that you will be targeted, you will be smeared, you will be accused, you will be defamed. I don't have time here to go into all the various ways I've been publicly attacked, credibility and professionalism called into account, workplace targeted, home life targeted, family harassed in the last 18 months. So you have to be brave in this moment. You have to unashamedly declare your position as being against anti-Palestinian racism, as being for Palestinian self-determination and resistance. And if you can't make that commitment, then you don't have a duty or a right to occupy the space to talk about Palestine. Many people have vulnerabilities that undermine their ability to do this. And if you have those vulnerabilities, we are sympathetic. But if that is the case, vacate the space. And so, look, in closing this together, and I am passionate about this, I'm running emotional and hot about this because there's enough going on to be emotional and hot about. This is not a time to be clumsy. Our role as educators in pursuing legitimate, justice-oriented peace building in Palestine as educators is to build on the powerful and eloquent Mohammed El-Kurd in his words when he says, we must raise the ceiling of what is permissible. This is the least we can do because this will require bravery in a world of censorship, in a world of smearing and rising autocracy packaged as respectability politics. But let's not only raise the ceiling, let's raise the roof. Let's own our language. Let's be bold and determined to call Zionism what it is. Let's affirm our commitment to a resistance and struggle for Palestine. Let's always refuse to be drawn into the respectable politics, one that sees no issue in platforming racists and promoting the viewpoints of a state committing genocide. Because if we truly believe, if we truly follow some of these principles, then the education that we provide as committed scholars and activists will be guided by a true commitment to an anti-colonial struggle that defines our time and our generation. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have spoken to you today. I hope it has landed well, and I look forward to some of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan. That was so powerful, and I'm really grateful also that you were able to be here today and share that with us. Also acknowledging what's going on right now as we speak in Rafah and in the West Bank, and that also brings more urgency to our task. And no need, as you say, there's no time for clumsiness, there's no time for mistakes. Following on from Brendan, we're going to now introduce our next speaker, Bana Abu Zuluf. Delighted to have Bana with us today. And Bana is a Palestinian educator an interdisciplinary PhD researcher in international law at the School of Law and Criminology in Maynooth University. She's an MA in International Relations and a BA in Human Rights and International Law. She's the local coordinator for a 5-year training project in social economy between Hassin University and Bethlehem University. And she's also a research and communications officer at the Good Shepherd Collective. Her research interests are epistemic oppression, intersectional solidarity, decolonization, and international law vulnerabilities. It is an honour to have you with us, Bana. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Leigh. I am very honoured to be here, and thanks for the organisers for organising this important webinar. So for me today, really, I hope to bring about the discussion on the framing. Again, Brendan mentioned the framing is very important. I know people are keeping an eye on what's happening on Gaza, but they're not understanding it as maybe like a broader, in the broader light of Zionism and its project in Palestine, and I want to be able to do that. And so I titled my presentation Demystifying Palestine, because I think there is, unfortunately, a tendency to complicate Palestine and what's going on in Palestine, and I think that's very dangerous. In fact, it's quite simple, and I hope to simplify it in my presentation today. I must also just note that when I mention students or educators, I actually use those simultaneously. We're all learning and we're all teaching others in many other ways. So I just want to flag that. If I do mention those, that, I'm still a student myself, and I learn every day, whether from organizations, whether from my work, and whether from what's going on in the ground. So in a way, I would like to just mention maybe like the key issue I find, at least in my experience, in academia, like let's say maybe in Ireland more specifically, about teaching Palestine, which is, how it's really framed. And too often Palestine is presented as maybe a conflict or a humanitarian crisis or a religious conflict or a geopolitical stalemate. And I think this is just simply a misdiagnosis. Obviously, we have people that mention apartheid here, and they mention genocide, and they mention, the wall, or they mention the Nakba, or they mention specific symptoms. And I think it's very important to differentiate the symptoms from the cause. So I think one of the issues I see is the people, titling it, oh, this is a case of apartheid, this is a case of just, ethnic cleansing alone. And I think it's very important to tell that, this all really kind of is a symptom of one thing, which is settler colonialism. I think one common identification that is used is Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think at this stage in time, in academics as well, educators and teachers should refrain from using that and should use things like Israeli settler colonial erasure, Israeli settler colonialism, Israeli settler colonial apartheid would be more suitable definitions. And in the next slide here, I think one thing that is that Brendan said so beautifully is that this is a process. It has not ended. I think there's a mistake here that people mention when they mention colonialism. They sort of put it, they only focus on the Nakba, and that afterwards, that the settler colonial project, just kind of somehow just manifested into a state, and that's become a legal state and a legal body. So the project has such ended, and also just limited really for the occupied Palestinian territory in legal terms and international law terms, which is the 1967 border of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So this is very, very problematic framing. Again, settler colonialism in this context actually manifested as really a process of bringing new settlers. So they had to continuously incentivize those, whether with birthright, promises of security, or eternal home for the Jewish people, and exclusivity of a Jewish homeland. So they needed to, and this process is continuous, and it happens all the time. And that leads to the expansion of settlements. That leads again to another process of settler colonialism and the continuation of settler colonialism, which is also the displacement of Palestinians. And how does that really happen? It happens through genocide, apartheid, and other coercive environment tactics. And again, I must use Patrick Wolf's, a very famous quote, which is, settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. So it's very important to not focus on certain events and to focus on it as a structure. I think educators need to focus on it as a structure. And when speaking about genocide, they need to relate it as a part and parcel of colonial erasure. The next thing really that I suppose I've become really passionate about lately is to speak about anti-Palestinian racism. And I think to really understand Palestine at the moment, right now, we have to look at how people were kept away from seeing what's happening for decades. We're talking about anti-Palestinian racism, but also anti-Arab racism, Orientalism, Islamophobia, etc., that are dominant in Western culture, media, and academia, etc. So even in a country very supportive of Palestine, in Ireland, even Brendan mentioned this. The media is an obvious note here, obvious actor here. So we have seen RTE, that Brendan very well mentioned. They use all the time Hamas-run health ministry. How many times have we heard them talk to Zionist reps and ambassador, occupational forces, IDF spokesperson, former prime ministers, etc.? How often have we seen them report Palestinians as passively dead, or they were just killed, passively? Obviously, this is not just an RTE thing. This is just generally in media, but even in Ireland, this has been the case, unfortunately. So the pursuit is, again, of balance that Brennan has been speaking about, often meant really platforming Israeli government spokespeople alongside Palestinian victims, as if the perspective is somehow symmetrical, right? So again, like this idea of balancing both sides, and that is very problematic. But it also exposed, why there is some form of exceptionalism here, right? So we've seen the contrast with the coverage of Ukraine. We've seen Ukrainian resistance as portrayed as heroic, and we've seen their suffering personalized. We've seen the solidarity with them unquestioned, and I mean by governments more essentially, more importantly. But also we've seen how Palestinian resistance on the other side is criminalized, and the death as well reported passively, etc. So we can see that there is some form of racist hierarchy, whose lives and struggles are deemed legitimate, but also whose lives are worthy of saving. This is an important concept for educators to talk about, which is the concept of necropolitics, right? This idea of the power to decide who gets to live and who gets to die. This is so prominent right now. We've seen it in Palestine with governments deciding which lives are worthy of saving, which lives are worthy of living. So students should be, taught to really read this critically, and we can actually equip them as educators with the tools to do so, not just for Palestine, but generally to be honest, just stay sane really in this world. We were seeing the world really become a very volatile and violent and very confusing. So it's very important for students to be equipped with that knowledge, with these concepts and how they live and how they materialize in reality. And Palestine becomes such a very prominent, in-your-face example of those concepts. Here I'm using the lovely Visualising Palestine map, and I've used it many times in my teachings, and I think like they have probably the best like visual kind of examples of what's going on in reality. So just these type of sources are quite very deep and important. And I do want educators to go deeper and look into Zionism as a settler colonial ideology. And I think this is something that I see is like an issue here, is that people kind of see it in isolation, that they see, Israel, Zionism, and settler colonialism. They don't really merge those together. And I think it's very important to not just look at Israeli policies, but also look at Zionism as an ideology. What does it mean to have Zionism? What does this logic of racial supremacy and right to colonize mean in this context? And then the fact that there's this forceful kind of this idea that Israel is not simply a state. It's just has gone too far. It has gone too far, and it's just, yes, it's founded on Jewish exclusivity, but it can be reformed in some ways or the other. I think these ideas need to be interrogated. These ideas need to be critiqued. Can we reform Zionism? Can we work through Zionism? And this opens the door to even what Brendan was talking about, the anti-Zionism as well. We've seen it being conflated right now with anti-Semitism. We're seeing how speech is curtailed, and anti-Zionism is painted as violent position, an anti-Semitic position. And it's very important for these type of conversations to happen. How does freedom of speech, academic freedom, is curtailed through this type of lens? We've seen in the Irish context the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. These things need to be discussed in classrooms. And I think one thing that I would like maybe to mention to educators is that Palestine is not just simply a context. It's not simply an example you can give to things. I think it's a lens. You need to be able to use Palestine as a lens. So, I believe that Palestine belongs to, several subjects. In fact, we can see Palestine in geography, environmental studies. Palestine offers a clear example of an environmental apartheid, environmental colonialism, where access to land, water, agriculture, natural resources is racialized and weaponized. We see the environmental destruction of Gaza, right? We see ecocide, and we see this being talked about all the time. What's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Gaza's environment. So you can even use that in classes where you're talking about the environment, if you're doing environmental studies. Literature and language, we have ample Palestinian poetry, memoirs, fiction, oral history that offers, really emotional, powerful, and politically rich materials. We have Ghassan Kanafani, Suzanne Abu Hawa, Mahmoud Darwish. We have many, many more. Arts and culture, we see this also more prominent. We see embroidery, graffiti. I know this in the north as well, the north of Ireland. We have these types of graffiti as well that used as a space to as a political space, really, an expression of identity. How can students learn about these parallels of using art as an expression of resistance? So, and many other, obviously, many other ways that we can use Palestine in different courses, in different classrooms. It doesn't have to be just politics and international law and history, etc. But when it comes to history, it's still very important to note that it's easy to be in a history class and just draw parallels. For example, I put this example because we're speaking from an Irish context, and a lot of our educators here today are working in Irish context. We see the famine, and the famine in Gaza, right? The Irish famine and the famine in Gaza. How can we understand that? How can we understand the fact that it's simply not just a passive famine, that there is a cause for that famine, that there are perpetrators, etc. The last thing I would just like to invite educators to do is to look at what meaningful solidarity looks like. Once you understand that Zionism is a settler colonial ideology based on the displacement and displacement of Palestinians, what does justice look like afterwards? Obviously, when Brendan was speaking about conflict and peace building, it was the prominent answer we were given all the time is I believe in the one-state solution. I believe in the two-state solution. Let's implement dialogue projects, etc., etc. But unfortunately, what we missed here is the First, there has been a misdiagnosis. Second, because of this misdiagnosis, the application and the solutions that are applied, or again, the fact that they're applied at all without even providing the Palestinians with the right to self-determination, is very problematic. So what does meaningful solidarity look like, right? We see in Ireland, students should, be able to look at their governments and be aware of the complicity of their governments. We have Cannon Airport being used to transport US arms and aid in the military-industrial complex that arms Israel. We have here a picture of Micheál Martin, the prime minister, who's, looking at the ceiling, an Israeli ceiling, and pointing at it. And obviously for Micheál Martin, that's not the same expression and that he uses against Palestinians that are massacred, and his interest does not lie in that. So maybe it's important to look at what students can learn from their government's positions. How can they partake in the political environment they are in? The fact that there is a form of depoliticization, unfortunately, is very problematic. It's the people and students and people just generally, they are electing these people, and they should be participating in the process of the political process and the decisions made by these governments. So it's important, that this is not about inducing guilt. It's about creating a space for responsibility, agency, and meaningful action. So teaching Palestine is not just about teaching a faraway place. It's about confronting how empire works, how racism hides in plain sight, how injustice is rationalized through language, but also how solidarity can be built through education. So Palestine, again, is not an exception. It's a window into the world we live in. So we must use Palestine as the lens. We must frame the situation correctly. And what we must, again, I echo Brendan's comments, we must be brave, because there's no time for being clumsy, as he said. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bana. Again, really powerful and very insightful. And again, coming to mind, the framing is everything. And recalling also what Brendan said about being brave and really addressing the misdiagnosis that's central to many people's understanding of this situation. And it is now my pleasure and honour to introduce our next speaker, who is Andrew Phelan. Has been teaching physical education for the past 24 years in Dublin. He has a BA in physical education and a master's in strength and conditioning. He is a passionate trade unionist and has been involved in trade unionism for the past 20 years. He played a key role in setting up the Global Solidarity Committee of the National Teachers Union, the ASTI. Sorry, that's the Association of Secondary Teachers Ireland, apologies. And he served a full term on the executive of that committee from 2015 to 2021. Spurred by his experiences being involved with the Shamrock and Olive Tree Boxing Project in a refugee camp in the West Bank, he decided to set up Teachers for Palestine with some colleagues, and that was set up in 2023. The main aim of Teachers for Palestine is to raise awareness about the history of Palestine and Israel's brutal military occupation. They organise a Let's Talk About Palestine week in schools, and they are currently setting up a twinning programme connecting schools in Ireland with schools in Palestine. Andrew, as part of Teachers for Palestine, has been on the streets demonstrating, calling for justice, calling for respect for international human rights since the beginning of this phase of the genocide in Palestine. And without further ado, I am going to hand you over now to Andrew to share his experiences and perspectives. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Leigh, and thanks to IDEA for the brilliant event. It's amazing when events like this come up, and it's not often that as educators that we all kind of get together from all the different environments that we're working in. So thanks to everybody. Brendan, amazing. Bana, really, really good insight as well. And so I suppose from my perspective, I would like to be a bit more practical, as in maybe I have some practical information on what it's like on the ground in secondary and primary schools in Ireland. So as you said, a few of us set up Teachers for Palestine. A few of us had been there, and we've always been talking through the trade union movement, about Palestine. And then I suppose October the 7th happened. And then the massive attack on Palestine and Gaza that followed. We were like, well, hold on, this is crazy. This needs to stop now. And we're in schools and nobody seems to be talking about this. And we were just flabbergasted, why is nobody in the staff room talking about this? Why are we not talking to students about it? It was just like silence and nothing happening. And we were like, well, why is this? And we started talking as a group and said, we need to do something about this. So we decided to set up Teachers for Palestine. And I suppose really in staff rooms is where we first noticed the silence. Because I think we live in our own bubble sometimes. Those who've been to Palestine don't know about Palestine. And this is not an excuse. But in our staff rooms, like nobody really knew what the history of Palestine was. Nobody knew about Zionism. Nobody knew about colonialism or knew about Palestine from that particular lens, as Bana was talking about. It was always, it's just a complicated conflict. I don't really know anything about it, so I'm just going to keep staring into my lunchbox here, So this was the kind of mentality in staff rooms, and we didn't even get to the students yet, So what we said then, well, if grown adults in our staff rooms don't know about this, how do we expect the students to even know about this? So this was the kind of crux of the process, the thinking process that we went through. And we said, well, we need to start with the students and we need to start teaching the students. So if whenever, which is still currently hasn't, if this attack ends, there's going to be another attack and there's going to be another attack and there's going to be another attack. We have to try to change what people's understanding of the situation in Palestine is. And of course, that is looking at it through colonialism, looking at it through Zionism, and actually what's happening there. So we decided to set up Teachers for Palestine and try to start introducing it into lessons in our schools. So beyond that point, we noticed that a group of us, so let's say there was about 100 odd of us who got together and said, right, we're going to take this into schools. This was just individually in our individual schools first. And what we noticed coming back was, you can't teach about that here. You can't do that fundraiser here, or you can't teach about that in your history class. You can't bring in a speaker from Palestine here. You can't do these things. This is what the principals and school management are saying. Even though, as Bana pointed out, anti-Palestinian racism, the previous couple of years, there is Ukrainian flags flying outside the school. They're talking about it constantly with the students. There's fundraisers for the Ukraine, bring in all these clothes, bring in food parcels, bring in money, raise the flag, talk about what's going on. But and rightly so, but when it came to Palestine, absolute silence. We can't do that because it's too political, is what principals were saying. So we kind of looked under the hood of that a little bit. And we found really that it wasn't coming from the top. So it's not coming from the Department of Education. Really what we found was, because some principals were doing it and doing a fantastic job and really allowing teachers to run with this and so on in schools, but an awful lot, a huge amount, I would say over 90% of the feedback we got was negative, weren't allowing it. It was fear. The principals were afraid of, I don't know enough about this situation to be able to answer questions. If RTE come knocking on the door of the school, why are you teaching about Palestine? What's happening here? I won't be able to answer these questions. I don't know how to answer a question if a parent rings up and complains because I don't know anything about the situation. So that's what we kind of found, and we were, okay, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with that? So we found maybe what we tried to do, one of the best ways we tried to do then towards the end of last year was to condense it all. So everybody, we would launch a week for Palestine where everybody in schools across the country would try and add a little bit about Palestine to their lessons in schools at the same time over the course of a week. That way we could promote it a month in advance, 6 weeks in advance. We could do posters, we could do flyers. We could start to build momentum into this rather than every individual teacher around the country trying to go by themselves to the principal and to be knocked back. So we tried to create this week, and we call this week Let's Talk About Palestine. And we're doing it again this year in May, which I'll tell you about in a second. But so for this week, we tried to create as much resources with the 100 teachers that we had, looking at from primary school all the way up to Leaving Cert. We tried to create as many resources as we could and put them online, so teachers who didn't really know anything about it could still pick little bits and pieces of what they were going to do. And the way we found to try to do this was the most revolutionary way, if you want, as Ciarán was talking about. It was not the two sides situation, it was not anything. So with primary schools, what we looked at was Palestine exists because, let's face it, they're trying to erase it from the map. So with primary schools, it was all based around the country of Palestine. Where is it? Here's a map of Palestine. Here's the flag's colours. Here's the culture. Here's the dances. Here's the food. So it was really about talking about Palestine. That's why we call it Let's Talk About Palestine. Because a lot of students, and there's a lovely children's book about a child who asks his grandmother, why is my country not on the map when they're at school? And this is the kind of the analogy that we drew from this, that we need to put Palestine on the map, and we need to make sure that all our primary kids and all children know that there is a country called Palestine. And this is what it is. And here's the beauty of it. Here's the amazing culture it has. And then when we get into secondary school, we start looking through all the different subjects. And it's very important to stick. There's loads of avenues, as Bana talked about, in our curriculum, that there's no excuse for teachers or principals not to allow this to be taught, because a lot of the curriculum can be taught through the lens of Palestine, especially with all new subjects and the way subjects are being taught nowadays. So we looked at, in secondary school, to look at Zionism, to look at colonialism, to look at all the things, racism, oppression, and to try and introduce that through all the different subjects through the lens of Palestine. So my own subject, to give you an example, is physical education, right? So in PE, there's a new Leaving Cert PE course. So you could, in that part of that PE course, talks about sports washing, right? So we can, of course, look at the money that the Israeli government pumps into sports to try and clean its image up on the international sphere, if you like. You could also, we talked about equity in sport. So, for example, FIFA, why are Israel, whilst they're committing genocide, still allowed to play in all the leagues, whereas Russia almost banned immediately after 2 or 3 weeks of their invasion. So all of these things, and this is in physical education. There's the dance that people could look at in physical education. Another thing that I did in PE was, so if we have a thing called Sport Ed, where a team, 5 or 6 teams would set up over the course of 6 weeks, let's say, they would play each other in a league. We looked at towns that were prior to 1948 were taken over by Israel. What were those towns called prior to 1948? And then the students would have to go away, find out about them, with the population, etc., etc. What happened to town? Why is it no longer there? And then they would represent that town in their league over the few weeks in PE. So there's loads of opportunity to teach about Palestine in PE and in all subjects. As Bana already went through, art, went through geography, went through history. They're all the obvious ones. You've all the different languages. There's loads and loads of opportunity, and there's actually no excuse for us not to teach it. For a lot of it, for 99% of it, you don't even have to go to your principal. You can just teach your subject using the curriculum and just using Palestine as the lens. So there's no real excuse there. Other areas that we try is bringing in speakers. We've brought in speakers from Palestinians who are here living in Ireland. A lot of them who have actually been there at the beginning of the genocide and managed to get out earlier on. We can bring them, and we've brought them into schools. We brought one into my own school to talk to students. But again, there is kickback here, but it's just about perseverance. And as Brendan said, it's about being brave. It's about saying, I'm not taking no for an answer here. And it's really getting together as teachers and I suppose across the country and standing together. That's why we did the whole week thing, rather than individuals going here and going there. But I mean, that's one of the things that we try. Now, I'll share my screen briefly, and just to show you, if I can share my screen here. this is what we did last year. Okay, so this is the poster that we sent out to all schools. You can see some of the things that schools can do: fly the flag in their community, outside of school, access teaching resources, and the QR code. I'll show you those in a second briefly. Hold a fundraiser in your school, organise collective shows of solidarity in your school. Some of our schools went down to walk the petition protest. They joined in that. So there's lots of students actually becoming active in this. And of course, it's all voluntary. We're not telling this class you have to go. It's if you want to go, some students out of the class will volunteer, will go. And this happened in quite a few places around the country. Lots of schools took part in this. Send written or video message support to children in Palestine. Again, we have all contacts with teachers on the ground in Palestine and students who are there currently in Gaza at the moment. Some of them, of course, have been killed, which is really, really upsetting for a lot of us in the Teachers for Palestine group. Stage arts, sport, writing, drama competitions, petition to make your school apartheid-free zone. Again, really, really important here. So these are a lot of the groups, as you can see, who would be involved, who of course, helped us out last year. So you can see a lot of them here today. You can see Kolov, you can see Centre for Global Education. You can see lots of some of the groups that would be part of IDEA were here. We're going to do that again this year. It's on the 5th of May this year, the 5th to the 10th of May. I think it's the 6th actually, is the Monday, the 6th to the 10th of May this year. So you see we have guidelines for schools, okay, what to say, what not to say, how to approach it, etc., etc. You can have a read of those yourselves. And then, of course, we have all the resources set up here. And this is where I'd like to ask this meeting, if anybody is a teacher here or even anybody lecturing anyone, if you have any resources that you think would be helpful, PowerPoints, even clips on YouTube or anything that could fit into any of these categories. I can stick the link in the chat in a second. You can see first, second class, third class, all the way through primary schools, secondary school. We have some Kolov resources there. Trocro are very good as well to give us some of their resources. We'll be adding to that as well. And then we have the apartheid-free schools. How do you try to make your school an apartheid-free? And a lot of the transition year groups, for example, in secondary schools, took up that apartheid-free thing, and we're going around their schools getting petitions and so on. So there is loads of ways in primary and secondary that we can introduce Palestine and act as a fight back, I suppose, against Zionism, against the oppression that's happening there. But also what we found as well in schools, a lot of students start to look at their own environment then and their own selves and have a look back at their own Irish history and so on. And it opens up their world, and people then start talking about what's happening in the Congo and Sudan and in all these places. It really opens the world for students into the wider world, I suppose, where IDEA is concerned as well. So I think it's really, really important that we do talk a lot more in our schools about Palestine and to realise that there is loads and loads of teachers out there who are doing it, and you're not alone, and to try and stand up against principals who say no, and try to educate them. This is why we need to do this, as Ciarán was talking about. And I think that's my time up anyway. So
thank you so much, Andrew. That was a brilliant whirlwind tour through really practical ways in which teachers can teach about Palestine and educate about Palestine, and great initiative, especially that Let's Talk About Palestine week. So moving on from Andrew, we have our final, but not the last but not least speaker, Aline Batarseh. Aline is the Executive Director at Visualising Palestine, and she has been since 2021. She has 20 plus years of experience working with several Palestinian and international nonprofits at the intersections of gender equality, children's rights, reproductive justice, mental health, and social justice. She has an MA from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and a BA in Communication Studies. Aline is also Palestinian, of course, from Jerusalem, occupied Jerusalem, and we are delighted to have her here. Over to you, Aline.
Thank you so much, Leigh, and thank you, Anya, also for your patience and in inviting me to participate in this discussion. I've been inspired by Brendan, Bana, and Andrew, and it's really sort of hard to follow, but I feel like there are so many threads that they touched on that I will reiterate, which is also a great way to sort of, this is part of educating, right? Some concepts need to continue to be repeated, even to ourselves. I will say that I was sad that educators and activists in Ireland are facing similar repression. I don't know how much the extent of it is, but it sounds similar to some of the challenges that educators and activists and organizers and students are facing here in the US, where I am based. Andrew, I think you ended on a very important note and intervention. And I think really starting with schools is such an important place when we talk about education. And starting with elementary, secondary schools, because a lot of times what happens is that as young adults, when students have finished their schooling, they end up having to unlearn. Right? We have to continue to unlearn some of those dominant narratives, which I'll be talking about in a minute. I'm also going to share my screen, actually. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about visualizing Palestine and our approach and sort of how you can practically use the resources that we have when you're educating about Palestine. So Visualizing Palestine uses data and research to visually communicate Palestinian experiences, to provoke narrative change. Our vision is a liberated future for Palestinians in a world free from oppression. What is our theory of change? Our theory of change is centered on shifting narratives. And this is what's so important. We believe that dominant narratives serve to obscure, justify, and perpetuate oppressive power structures in society. To shift this narrative, we invite people to engage with our visuals, to examine the role that dominant narratives play in sustaining a harmful status quo and preventing collective imagination for a liberated future for all. We believe that both those dominant narratives not only justify the power structures that exist, but they also prevent us from imagining a different future. We're at VP, we're dedicated to create narrative interventions that shift those power dynamics, and we're very much focused on making Palestinian narratives more visible, accessible, powerful, and part of wider anti-colonial and anti-racist narratives. Those are, concepts that Bana, Brendan, and Andrew referred to as well. So our role in the movement for Palestinian liberation is really to resource the movement. So you all can, access our resources through our website. Our visuals are there and they're used constantly, actually, by educators, by students, by activists, by organizers, to educate, to raise awareness, to advocate for justice on Palestine. We have more than 300 visuals on our website that you can access, 13 educational platforms. We have a huge following on social media, so if you don't follow us there yet, please do. We've had more than 106 student groups use our visuals in their organizing and awareness raising. And also through our website, what we encourage people to do is to use our download system to download visuals, because it helps us track why and who is using our visuals and gives us really good information around the tools that are helpful for educators and organizers. We are supported by more than 700 grassroots VP members who really help us continue to do the work that we're doing without intervention, on what we can say or do. So all of our visuals are Creative Commons licensing, which really means that they are there for you to use for free, to download and use in your education and advocacy purposes, as long as there are some, for our visuals to be used, they can't be altered, we have to be credited, and the visuals should not be used for commercial purposes. Bana had a great example of how, the visuals should be used in any work that you do. If you go to our website, you will see that you can download, and I included the link to our visuals page earlier during the conversation. But basically, you can filter by theme, you can filter by type, you can filter by language. Our visuals are constantly translated by volunteers into different languages. We commit to producing visuals in English and Arabic. And then in terms of types of visuals, you will find infographics are the most prominent type of work that we produce, but we also have interactive projects and videos as well. So I wanted to make a note about the themes on our website. As I mentioned earlier, you know, all of our visuals are really centered on the experience of Palestinians, and it builds on decades of work by activists who have been working towards mainstreaming key frameworks. The most important framework that I want to mention here, that Bana also mentioned, that Brendan also mentioned, is that theme of settler colonialism, right? When we talk about the Nakba, when we talk about apartheid, when we talk about genocide, these are all manifestations of settler colonialism and its manifestations of unchecked impunity of the Israeli government. And so all of these themes are also present in the most recent book, or the first book that Visualising Palestine produced in September 2024. And I encourage you to check out this. In addition to the visuals on our website, you can also, and I dropped a link in the chat, you can also utilize the book as an additional tool to educate on these themes. What I would like to mention as well is that you know, all of the work that we do, the visuals that we produce, even the book that we produced, you know, it's important to focus on settler colonialism and its manifestations and the different ways it's manifested. It's also important for us at Visualising Palestine, and for Palestinians, I think, in general, to really focus on how Palestinians have been resisting these manifestations. And Brendan did such a beautiful job talking about this, right? Palestinians have been resisting in many ways for decades. We have ongoing popular protests, we have hunger strikes by prisoners, we have counter mapping efforts, which Visualising Palestine is actually quite extensively engaged in. We talk about cultural persistence and assertion of who we are. I'm featuring here one of our interactive platforms, which is called Gaza Lives, Resisting Cultural Genocide. It's a really important tool. It took us more than a year to work on it with an organization, a storytelling organization called Continentalist, based in Singapore. And you know, all of these tools are really important ways to also show how Palestinians celebrate life, right? And refuse to give in to oppression. We also focus heavily on the successes of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and on the importance of collective action by students, educators, musicians. I have some examples here on you know, on some of the intersections with other movements, and also bringing in environmental justice, talking about how Palestine, again, is a lens, but is also interconnected to other struggles and other movements for liberation. And this is an important issue to continue to bring attention to. For example, this one visual on divesting for justice, we, you know, took the data for that visual, and we interpreted it through different ways and different types of infographics. And I think this is, you know, important to mention, because our data is so focused on, our visuals are so focused on data. And you can also bring this lens to students. Students can be invited to look at the visuals, but also explore the data behind the visuals. And this is just an example of the data set that was used for the Divesting for Justice visual. And when you go to our website, every visual will have the data sources linked to it. So, I mean, I think I'll just step back for a second. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but in terms of how educators can use our work. You know, one question that the moderators shared with us was, how can educators discuss justice when they teach about Palestine? I think I want to mention three things that have been already mentioned in this discussion. Focusing on the root causes of injustice is very, very important. Focusing on you know, the framework of settler colonialism and how it's manifested is really important. And then VP's visuals can be used to introduce students to a topic visually, but then A visual cannot tell a complete story. So I always encourage people to go and dig into the data and ask students, how else would you use this data? How would you visualize this story? And then using VP's visuals to encourage students to reflect on their role and their responsibility as global citizens to work towards justice, to work towards liberation, right? Oftentimes when we look at Palestine, I think, Bana referred to this, people talk about this issue being complicated. We don't know what the solutions are. Palestinians have been talking about the solutions for decades, and then also going back to this question around conflict, really challenging the concept that we are talking about a conflict. This is not a conflict. This is not a two sides issue. This is an issue of settler colonialism. And I think that's really important narrative shift and a narrative intervention, maybe the most important, because it really changes how people interact with Palestine. I'm just going to refer to one of the resources that was, and I think, Andrew, this is one of the resources that you can maybe add to the list of resources that you have. This is one of my go-to resources, Rethinking Schools, just released, and it's an organization based in the US. It just released a really important book and tool called Teaching Palestine. And this book is just so rich with resources. One of the pieces that I love the most in this book is called Independence or Catastrophe. I'm not sure how it is in Ireland, but I suspect it's very similar to how it is in the US. Teaching 1948, the Nakba, from multiple perspectives is really important. In the US, there is so much focused on the creation of Israel after the Holocaust and the importance of the Jews having a country of their own. And there's no mention of, this happening at the expense of Palestinians and the population that was already living there. So I think that's a very important tool and educational resource to bring into schools, because there's that dominant narrative, the Zionist narrative, is already permeating. Bana used a similar visual to this, which is the Zionist colonization of Palestine. And Palestine shrinking, expanding Israel is a really important another tool that can be used in schools that really refers to how, it didn't start with 1948. The settler colonialism started before this, right? And this is a really an easy way sort of to bring this to the attention of students who might not understand what settler colonialism is, but can understand and see what it means when there is land grab, when there is a population replacing another, so there are different ways to bring attention to what settler colonialism means for Palestinians on the ground through using these tools. Another really important thing I want to mention, and Bana referred to this as well, we have to address what's happening in Palestine as a whole rather than as a fragment, right? This is a challenge when we talk about Gaza. The Israeli genocide in Gaza is not an isolated incident, and it is our responsibility to place it in this historical context. So, for example, last year, during Nakba commemoration in May 2024, we produced this visual to really show this ongoing Nakba, this ongoing expulsion, ongoing destruction of homes and villages and people's lives, ongoing massacres, and ongoing colonization and Zionist ideology to continue to colonize Palestine, right? This is not hidden, it's all out there. Just one more visual I wanted to refer to, which is, again, what original villages did Gaza's Palestinians come from, right? When we talk about Gaza, a lot of times I think people think that Gaza is a country. It's not a country. It's 1% of historical Palestine, right? It's a very tiny piece of a larger puzzle. And it's really important to refer to the 70% Palestinians who are refugees and have been displaced from their homes in 1948. In conclusion, if you want to use one tool, I would definitely encourage you to explore Visualizing Palestine 101. which is an educational platform that's on our website, and I'm including this in the chat. And really, it's a comprehensive tool where students and educators can learn about the historical context, can learn about the system of control, the structural inequality, and can also learn about international impunity, right? And future possibilities. And I really wanted to end at the future possibilities part, because I don't want, the moment that we're in, it's so easy to give into hope, to give into actually despair, and it's so easy to give up. And this is actually the moment where we should not be giving up. We should continue to push forward. We should continue to amplify Palestinian narratives and calls for liberation. And we have visual tools that can help you explain to students, what are some of those future possibilities, to challenge the concept that the right of return is not possible, to call for equal rights for Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, to call for an end to the occupation, to call for return. And these are the demands of the Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which a lot of Palestinians are part of, obviously. So I will end there, and thank you all so much for listening.